fly ball into right field. She is gone. In a year that has been so improbable, the impossible has happened. This one by Mattingly. Oh, hang on to the roof. Goodbye, home run. Don Mattingly. Tucker waits one. Deep left field. Down the line. That ball is out of here. Out of here.
Welcome back to an episode of TableSetters covering all things Major League Baseball. As always, I'm Steve, joined with my tag team partner, Devin. What's going on, man?
What's going on, Steve? I'm excited to talk some baseball tonight. I looked back, it's been about a little more than a month since we had a team-centric focused episode. We talked to Joey Capone about the Red Sox about a month ago, and I'm excited to get going back with that tonight as baseball and spring training inches ever so close, or closer and closer at least.
So without further ado, today we're excited to welcome Mike Petraglia from the Code Reds, the Cincinnati Reds podcast by CLNS Media, a seasoned sports journalist since 2017. He's been covering the Reds and MLB. And of course, you guys are into the football stuff, the Bengals as a columnist and the host of the Jungle Roar podcast. Deep ties to Cincinnati sports, man. Brings expert insights into the Reds. We're looking forward to all the outlook for 2025. You guys can follow him on the X Machine at Trags. That's TRAGS. Mike, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing tonight?
I am looking forward to being on with you, gentlemen, and talking some baseball. I must tell you, this is about as excited as Reds Nation and Reds Country, as it's so called, here in Cincinnati in the tri-state region. This is as excited as they've been for a Reds season in as long as I can remember. And yes, that includes those years back in 2010, 2011, 2012, when they were going to the playoffs with Dusty Baker. With Terry Francona, I got to tell you, I cannot wait. And I think a lot of Reds fans are waiting for spring training to get here in Goodyear.
So you mentioned it right here from the jump. The Reds made a significant move this offseason with the hiring of the aforementioned Terry Francona as their manager. So let's start there. What kind of impact do you see him having on this team, particularly in terms of shaping that clubhouse culture that he's been so known of doing that and affecting overall performance from this team?
I think accountability is a word that gets tossed around a lot. And I think it's not so much that the players last year weren't accountable and didn't feel bad that they made mistakes. Terry Francona is trying to instill a responsibility both on the base pass, in the field, defensively, becoming a more fundamentally sound team. Why is that? Because Terry Francona knows he's coming and taking over a team that has a ton of young talent. But what young talent needs is direction and discipline. And I think that's what you're going to start to see from the Reds. At least you're going to hear that preached in spring training in Goodyear. And I think that's going to carry on into the season. And, you know, that is really what I think Terry Francona is bringing in to Cincinnati. It's different than it was when I covered him in Boston. He had very much had a veteran team that was ready to win now. This team is ready to compete now, and it has a very high ceiling, but it's still a very young core inside that clubhouse, starting with people like Tyler Stevenson, Hunter Green. Those are the guys that I think are going to be leaned on heavily. But again, we're talking about 25, 26-year-olds. And so Terry Francona has to instill, again, discipline and accountability on the field.
So we're going to talk plenty about some of that homegrown youth as we go through tonight. But I want to start with a new player for the Reds. They have not been shy about making some moves here. Gavin Lux comes over from the world champion Dodgers, kind of caught some people by surprise, especially after Jonathan India was moved. I think there's some confusion about where he's going to fit and if there's some other moving pieces here. Do you see Lux taking the second base role? Matt McClain, who's coming back from injury, potentially moving to the outfield. I know we saw him in the Arizona Fall League get some reps there. What do you anticipate the moves are going to be there when Francona fills out the lineup card?
I would say, and it's just this is guesswork right now. First of all, I don't think they're going to flip Gavin Lux. I know there was that rumor mill right in the hours and the days immediately after the Reds acquired him last week that they would just flip him to the New York Yankees. I don't see that being the case right now at all. They want Gavin Lux because it gives Terry Francona more of a veteran presence who has World Series experience, but who can play all over the infield, can be a DH, has not played much at third base, but has played shortstop, has played second base. They've got to figure out where is Matt McClain most comfortable coming into spring training. Going into 2024, Matt McClain was the assumed second baseman. Then he got hurt. Then everybody knows Jonathan India was called upon to go back to the future, so to speak, take over his old job at second base. And I thought he did reasonably well for the whole season. But they acquired Gavin Lux, a left-handed bat, for versatility and to improve their WAR, their offensive production at third base, at first base, at second base, and at the DH position. Nick Kroll, the president of baseball operations, guys, pointed to the lack of WAR and the lack of offensive production at third base and at the DH spot. They were last in the National League last year, and they wanted to address that, and Gavin Lux was the way to do that offensively. Their attitude is when we get to spring training, we'll figure out where Matt McClain fits in best, where Gavin Lux fits in best.
So speaking of McClain, obviously he comes up for a bit in 2023 and looks great. It looks like he's going to play the part for a long time for this team. And then a lost season last year, unfortunately, where he couldn't get on the field. How confident are you that he can come back seamlessly, re-entering this lineup and help this team right away?
Based on what I've heard in terms of the reports and speaking with Nick Kroll after the season and speaking with some other people in the organization, I'm very confident. His bat definitely had some pop in spring training, in Arizona Fall League. I believe he had 5 home runs and 15 or 20 RBI. He looked very strong at the plate, and that is really what the Reds front office was looking for from McClain is he going to get back physically to where he was 2023, like you said, at the plate? Is he going to be aggressive? Is he going to be able to spray the ball all over the ballpark like he did as an impressive rookie back 2 years ago when he came up? I think the answer is yes. I'm fairly confident at this point that the Reds are confident that he will be able to come back and be that bat in the lineup that they desperately need. Again, I'm going to repeat what I said a couple of minutes ago. The Reds are most concerned about a productive offensive deep lineup because they feel that was the number one thing missing last year from them becoming a competitive team. They just did not have enough depth, quality depth in that lineup when certain pieces went down with injury.
So on the other side of it with the pitching, the rotation looks deeper this year with notable additions like Brady Singer, and we get a full season from Rhett Lauder. We got Hunter Green leading the charge. What do you consider to be the key factor for this rotation as far as them being successful throughout the whole campaign of 2025?
Nick Lodolo, without question. He needs to be healthy. He has the best stuff on the staff. He has the best major league ready stuff. Hunter Green made huge strides last year, and I think his numbers bear that out as a National League All-Star. I don't think there's any question about that. He is a leader on that pitching staff, but in terms of pure stuff, it's Nick Lodolo. The problem with Nick Lodolo is conditioning and staying on the mound healthy. And that is something he's got to prove to Derek Johnson, who is remaining from the David Bell staff, the David Bell run regime in Cincinnati. Derek Johnson is very well respected inside the organization for the job he's done in developing this young core of pitchers led by Hunter Green, Nick Lodolo, Andrew Abbott, another lefty pitcher that the Reds need to see come to spring training in better shape, better conditioned, ready to hit the ground running. He was not in full shape when he reported in 2024, and he was kind of behind the 8 ball to start the season. Started on the injured list, only missed, I think, 1 or 2 starts to begin the season, but still, they need Andrew Abbott to be ready to go hit the ground running. So I would say Nick Lodolo right at the top of that list in terms of priorities for the pitching staff entering this season, followed closely by Andrew Abbott. 2 guys that they are going to rely on heavily and for good reason in the rotation.
So we know how temperamental the bullpens can be, but it's nice at the back end of the bullpen with Alexis Diaz becoming that go-to closer for some time at this point. But there's been some whispers around Reds Twitter and other angles of social media that free agent Carlos Estevez potentially joining the bullpen. So for you, how do you think Estevez would fit into the mix if he was to join? And what would this addition bring to the late inning situation? Is it Alexis Diaz's job to lose, or is this something that is open for discussion come February?
I think it's open for discussion come February. I think certainly Alexis Diaz has that job to start spring training, but he's going to have to win it back. And he's going to have to show Terry Francona, obviously not that he can get it done in the ninth inning, because you really don't see that until the season begins, but that his stuff is there, that he's fully healthy, that his mindset is in there. He has the right mental space, as they say, to start the season and start spring training for that matter. That's what Terry Francona and Derek Johnson, the pitching coach, have to get a quick gauge on from Alexis Diaz. Now, I just had a Freudian slip there. Estevez is certainly somebody they could look at, but I'll tell you that Graham Ashcraft, to me, is the wild card in that bullpen. He has tremendous stuff, and there has been a lot of talk inside the Reds organization about whether or not Graham Ashcraft's stuff would lend itself and translate to a late inning situation, perhaps a seventh inning, perhaps an eighth inning type of reliever. And that could really extend the Reds bullpen if Ashcraft is open to that. And, given his tumultuous season last year, and that's being kind, where he went up and down twice, and he still couldn't figure things out, and obviously suffered an injury that landed him on the injured list for the remainder of the year. He had a very difficult year last year. Maybe a new start in the bullpen is what Graham Ashcraft and the Reds need.
So we wouldn't be able to do this episode without asking some kind of question about Elly De La Cruz.
Of course.
I wore the EDLC in Cincinnati shirt for this occasion. I'm a Mets fan. Steve is a Yankee fan. We're New Yorkers here, but I would say outside of my own team, Elly's probably my favorite player, at the very least, to watch. So Steve and I had this conversation shortly after Juan Soto signed for his insane deal. And we said, do you think we're going to see a $1 billion player in the next 10 years? And the only name we could come up with where it's like, maybe if the ceiling is reached, is an Elly De La Cruz, because of everything he can do. So 2 questions here. He still has some holes in his game that he's working on. He can still make strides, which obviously strikeout rate is kind of the first thing that people point to. What's it like watching him day in and day out? And what do you think his ceiling is over, say, the next 5 years?
Watching him day in and day out, he is the most electric player here in Cincinnati since Eric Davis. I don't think there's any question about that. He can do things on the field that nobody else, certainly in the organization, and very, very few people in baseball can do. Some would argue he can do things in baseball that nobody else can do in the sport. But Elly De La Cruz, one thing about covering him on a daily basis, he is very unassuming. For all of the talent he has, he is a quiet, reserved guy in the clubhouse. Part of that's age. There's no question about that. He is still learning where he fits in the everyday kind of atmosphere of a major league clubhouse. There is still some of that. He's only 22, going to be 23 years of age this year. And he is still learning his way around a major league clubhouse. But watching him every day, there's always the sense when you come to the ballpark, you're going to see something you haven't seen before, whether it's stealing 3 bases on 2 pitches like he did a couple of years ago in Milwaukee, whether it's hitting for the cycle, whether it's going first to home on a routine single to right center field. Those are the kind of things that you experience with Elly De La Cruz that you really don't see anywhere else. Maybe it's watching him try to score from second base on a routine grounder to shortstop because the throw is a little deeper in the hole than the shortstop expected, and Elly doesn't let up. One of the things I will tell you about Elly De La Cruz, he hustles and goes as hard, sincerely hard, as any player I have seen in the last, I'd say, 10 years of baseball. He is just all out all the time. In terms of his ceiling, to me, his ceiling is something along the lines of probably, I would say, a combination of, this is difficult for me right off the top of my head because so many names are. See, I'm an older generation Reds. I grew up a Reds fan, grew up here in Cincinnati. Eric Davis is the name that comes to mind the most. Mm-hmm. If Elly De La Cruz can stay healthy, he's what Eric Davis would have been had he played 10 years in the majors. He's the name that comes to mind most fervently in my mind. And when I say that to other people here in Cincinnati of that generation, they say if he's healthy, Elly De La Cruz is going to dwarf the numbers that Eric Davis put up. Mm-hmm. And I remember the 1987 season that Eric Davis had when he had the first 30-50 year, I believe it was. We're talking about a player who had a 20-60 year last year in Elly De La Cruz, and I think he's going to have more of that to come. I think, his ceiling is all-star year in and year out, and a potential Triple Crown winner down the road. That's his ceiling.
And when you think of that, you have to think of the money he's going to command, knowing that may be the ceiling for him. We did a Pirates episode about a month and a half ago, and we were kind of asking, is there any chance Paul Skeens could be extended by the Pirates, or is he just destined for LA, New York, Boston, those teams? And this is what baseball's kind of become recently. It's a little controversial as far as no salary cap. So these great players that are brought up somewhere else, a lot of times end up going to one of the big market clubs when they are able to. But we've also seen this trend where teams are trying to lock up and buy out arbitration and lock up their guys early. The Braves have done it constantly. You look at what Ronald Acuna is getting paid right now, and it seems like, even though the injuries, it still seems like he should be paid triple that based on what he can do.
Sure.
Has there been any talk about trying to do something like that with Elly, where they can extend his time in Cincy right now?
There has not, that I have heard. I think they are still working their way through the TV contract, which was redone this week. The announcement came out that they will not be going to Major League Baseball. They've got a couple of extra $1 million thanks to a reworked deal with FanDuel Sports Network. And, the Reds do not have the bottomless pit that other teams, like obviously the Mets, the Yankees, Dodgers, Red Sox, Cubs, teams like that they have. And they know that, and they realize that. So they are going to try to get the most out of a player like Elly while they have the budget that they have to work with. I don't think they feel comfortable at this point spending money and going beyond their budget even 4 or 5 years down the road. I know they're not comfortable doing that. And until the financial specter of the ownership changes, I think they are going to stay more conservative than not.
So you mentioned the TV network stuff that came out on the 13th of this month. Just a couple days ago. FanDuel Sports Network going to be producing them. This is a 1-year deal, kind of a stopgap between what actually has to happen. So we've been talking about Diamond Sports Group for quite some time. They're going to be called Main Street Sports at this point. But what is your thought on the future of this? Because Devin and I were talking about the accessibility of watching the games, but there seems to be a lot of the piecemeal, because there's a streaming option for this as well, where we could possibly see them move away from that brick and mortar cable, where you can actually have the ability to maybe buy one team's amount of games without the blackout restrictions that we all hate.
Yeah. And look, I'm one of those people that can't stand the blackout restrictions, because it's unnecessary. You want to expand the sport. And I think, frankly, for all of the early grief that Rob Manfred took he's had a good 2 to 3 year run. I think you guys would agree, of popularizing the sport, doing things that have made the sport certainly more consumable, no question. But you've got to figure out the TV, and you've got to figure out the distribution part of the equation for the sport to take that next jump. And I think that's what they're trying to figure out. And the teams, meanwhile, especially the teams more impacted, the middle market, the smaller market teams like the Reds, like the Pirates, go down the list, but certainly those two teams come to mind. They have got to figure out, how are we going to run our budget if a RSN gets pulled from us, Regional Sports Network gets pulled from us, and they go into bankruptcy, but Major League Baseball cannot provide the type of revenue that we need. Well, the Reds, for instance, went back and decided, well, we'll rip up the deal with Major League Baseball, kick that can down the road 1 year, and maybe they'll do that for the next couple of years until Major League Baseball comes out with a more profitable formula that will put more cash in the pockets of owners like Bob Castellini of the Reds, who need that cash desperately to go out and do deals like you were mentioning a couple of minutes ago, long-term deals with their own homegrown talent like Elly De La Cruz.
It seems like a lot of people are resistant to making those long-term deals because we don't know what the future of sports and entertainment is at this point, because everything's changing. The NFL has been on all these platforms. You would have told someone 20 years ago that Amazon would be hosting football games or Netflix would be hosting live sporting events. I think we all have been like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So I think everyone is resistant to hopping into even a 5-year deal, because by 2030, who even knows what the market looks like for streaming sports?
Well, some of these small markets may have to get creative. Like, let's say the Reds decide to enter into a deal with Netflix like the Red Sox did, and have somebody follow the Reds around and do a special Reds-centric feature that is streamed alongside their broadcast product over multiple platforms. You're going to have to get creative. If you're these teams, you're going to have to figure out solutions like that. And right now, it's the unknown. I'm not going to say, sit here and criticize the Reds for doing something that they may be thinking about in months and years from now. But that's what teams like the Reds are going to absolutely have to do. They're going to have to get creative. They're going to have to, pinch every bit of draw every bit of financial blood out of that stone possible to make the deals work and retain as much Major League talent as possible if you're going to compete for World Series.
So moving back to some of that on the field right now, let's talk about Noelvi Marte and Christian Encarnacion Strand, who both sidelined 2024 for both different reasons. Of course, Marte due to the suspension and Encarnacion Strand with the wrist injury. How do you see their role shaping up for 2025 with the aforementioned additions and how the team's shaking up? And what's your expectations for them singularly? Because Noelvi Marte was highly touted prior to everything that went down with the PED suspension. And obviously Encarnacion Strand was highly touted after as well.
Well, I'm going to bring up a meeting that Terry Francona had within, I think, 2 weeks of accepting the job here in Cincinnati. He went down to the Dominican to meet with Noelvi Marte, with Jamer Candelario, and with Elly De La Cruz. And the understanding with that meeting was how serious are all of you about reporting to camp, being ready to go once spring training hits the ground running in February. And of those three players, the one that I think Terry Francona was trying to communicate with the most was Marte. Because, look, Francona knows. I mean, he was out of baseball only 1 year in 2024. He knows full well that Marte is a special type of talent, an explosive talent, a little bit like Rafael Devers with the Boston Red Sox, same position, third base, but he has big time maturity issues, and he has to grow up. He has to understand that there are things you cannot do in the off season to get yourself put yourself in jeopardy for the regular season. And clearly he did that last year, and he got caught for it. And so now he has to eat a little bit crow. He has to be he has to be very humble coming to camp and ready to do anything that the team needs him to do. Maybe it means he's not playing third base right away. Maybe it means he starts in AAA to start the season at this point. We really don't know where his starting point is, but in terms of what he could be to help the Reds down the road in 2025, I think he can be a big factor. As far as Christian Encarnacion Strand, he is pure right-handed power. And the reason he's got a spot somewhere on the field, whether it's first base, whether it's DH, whether it's left field, is because the Reds still have precious few dependable right-handed power bats. They have Tyler Stevenson, they have Spencer Steer, and if healthy, they have Christian Encarnacion Strand. I don't think you put Stuart Fairchild in there. He's a platoon outfielder. Certainly, Jose Trevino is a backup catcher. He's somebody that could help in that regard. Elly De La Cruz is switch hitter, of course, but they have precious few power right-handed bats, and that's what Encarnacion Strand could really offer them this year if he's healthy.
When you mentioned Noelvi Marte maybe having some maturity issues, especially in the offseason when he's away from the team, I can't help but think about Fernando Tatis Jr. Having similar issues, and he had the PED suspension. He also had some other incidents of things he probably shouldn't have been doing. With Marte, have there been any other issues that they know about other than the PEDs that he should have been staying away from, or was it really just that one?
No, it's just the PEDs. It's how you handle yourself in the off season and your training, your weight control. It's all physical with him. We have not heard of any rumblings of any other, discretion, what's the word I'm looking for?
Like extracurricular activities.
Nothing like that. Nothing like that would raise red flags. I think the issue is maturity with Noelvi Marte and just maturity. Nothing that would lead the Reds to be concerned about his behavior on a day in and day out basis.
So to bounce back to the pitching just for a little bit here, and I want to mention a little bit of the minor league side. So we mentioned Rhett Lauder earlier coming up last year, but also the Reds have another Wake Forest alum that is now their #1 prospect in Chase Burns. MLB.com, if you look at their top 100 page, they have Burns ETA at 2026. But Steve and I talk about all the time, these ETAs more and more seem to be beat by these players. Any chance 2025 we could see him at some point, and what would he have to do to make that happen?
Well, I think he'd have to go along the path of what Rhett Lauder did, and Rhett Lauder was he really rocketed up the charts very quickly and showed that he could he not only could handle it in terms of maturity, like we've mentioned a lot here in this podcast, but he had major league ready stuff. And the Reds are going to have to make a decision if he puts up the numbers. Is Chase Burns, is his stuff going to translate on a major league level day in and day out from start to start or from appearance to appearance? He could be a guy if I always recall David Price with Vanderbilt back in 2008, I believe it was, with Tampa Bay. He came up and played a huge role in the postseason against the Red Sox and pitched in that Game 7, I believe it was, at Tampa, the one that Tampa won to advance to the World Series. A guy like Chase Burns could have that kind of impact if he shows he can handle everything at the minor league level. And when you're talking about a Chase Burns, you're talking about a guy that is very well accomplished, like Rhett Lauder was at Wake. And, when an organization like the Reds has a measure of success with a certain program like they did with Wake, it's natural for the Reds to go back to that well and test it again and again and see if, well, maybe there's something about the way the players come through that system, through that program, and are major league ready more quickly than your average or even above average college baseball star.
So we were talking about the ETAs being beat, and I was going to ask you a question similar to that. Do you think it's because the NCAA talent pool is getting better, or do you think it's more that these teams are giving them more of a chance earlier and kind of doing a risk reward thing when it comes to the money and them playing early on in their deals?
Well, I think part of it, absolutely, that's a great point, is financial, because the major league teams know, well, these guys, even if you start their clock early, they're under control for a longer period of time, and maybe they have the arms that can help you over the course of a season. There is obviously the sweet spot of you don't want to overexpose them too quickly, because sometimes that can backfire and set a player back if they're not emotionally ready to handle everything that comes with being a major league player. But if they're physically ready and show signs of being emotionally ready as well, certainly I think the trend is to use more and more college players on smaller market teams like the Reds, like the Pirates. You've certainly seen that. And it makes a lot more sense for these younger players to help you if you believe that their stuff is major league ready. There's no doubt about that. And I don't think there's any shame in doing that. I have been one who has always believed that the Reds have not been aggressive enough in that regard. If you're not going to go out and pursue the free agency market like other teams can, and have obviously almost double the financial resources in some cases, well, then be creative. Find another way to acquire and procure that talent. And certainly major Division I college pitchers who can throw between 95 and 100 and have a 3 to 4 pitch mix. The Reds have done a very good job over the last couple of years in really loading up their farm system with pitchers like that, and acquiring them in trades. We saw that in the Luis Castillo trade. They did that as well, acquiring 2 to 3 pitchers, stockpiling their farm system so that they have a multitude of pitchers that they can try and develop. And if, let's say, of those 5 or 6 young arms, if 3 show themselves to be major league ready, well, those are 3 pitchers that can help you add to a rotation that I think is ready to compete for a deep playoff run.
So no matter the reason that the path gets shorter from the draft until major league ready, I know you're a big NFL guy, you cover the Bengals, as we mentioned in the intro. That becomes an event. The NFL draft is an event for fans to attend and to watch, just as any sporting event. Do you see a foreseeable future that Rob Manfred in this tenure can get this MLB draft to feel like that? I understand the time and place being the fact that it's in the middle of the season is a problem, but how do we get this to feel like a tentpole event where these players that you're drafting feel like they have an imminent effect on the team, similar to the NFL?
Well, I mean, I know they've worked around or worked with the idea of having the draft around the College World Series, having the draft around the All-Star game, trying to find that sweet spot of where it can be on the calendar. But frankly, I don't think it's about the timing of the event. I think it's about promoting the players. It's about promoting the product. Because to me, the reason the NFL draft works the way it does is because fans follow a lot of these players intensely from either the end of their club's regular season in the NFL, from then, whether that's December, maybe in some cases in November if your team's really out of it, but from January through until the beginning of April and mid-April, when you have all of those draft days, you have all of those workout days, you have exposure of these players almost 24/7 on a channel, the NFL Network, that is dedicated to promoting the NFL draft. You don't have the infrastructure in baseball yet to do that. There's certainly MLB Network has done a very commendable job of trying to promote some of the younger players, trying to promote the college game. And no question about that. It's just not at the same marquee level that the NFL is. And to me, that's okay. If you're a baseball fan and your team is interested in drafting or needs to draft well in the first, let's say, 5 rounds, and let's say in those first 3 rounds there are major league ready or could be major league ready players, that's okay. To me, that's a starting point for all of this, is to try and get fans interested in players that get selected who could contribute very close to right away.
No, it's a really good point and good conversation that everybody keeps having just about I mean, the popularity of the NFL is, as you mentioned before, not really comparable to really anything in the world here because the NFL is king, as we always say. But the draft is an essential part of it, and it's clear as day. As you mentioned, some of these guys, NIL deals get them all paid now, but they entered the NFL draft. The Shedeur Sanders of the world, who knows if he winds up being a quality quarterback, but he is already a superstar, and that just says everything you need to know about football.
No question. But understand, and you guys know this, college football is almost at the same exposure level that the NFL is. You cannot say the same about college baseball. And to me, that's unfortunate because I think there are a lot of great college baseball programs out there. But, you're talking about college baseball competing against March Madness. College baseball starts essentially in February, and it builds and builds and builds. Well, you're competing at that point against March Madness, then the Stanley Cup playoffs, the NBA playoffs, start of the Major League Baseball season. There's a lot in that mix to compete with. And so what baseball has to do is come up with some type of a way of, channeling some of these college baseball programs into their Major League Baseball product through channels like obviously the Major League Baseball Network or MLB.com, which again has done a tremendous job over the years of developing a pipeline, as it were, no pun intended, for a lot of these younger players or these college stars. And to me, that's the way you're going to have the most success in terms of generating as much exposure for your stars. Look, this whole thing about the draft, whether it's in football, baseball, basketball, it doesn't matter. It's about exposing, creating the exposure for your stars of the future. And whatever way you feel is best to do that across as many platforms as possible, that's what you have to do.
So pivoting a little bit here, I think we have to bring up Pete Rose. The Reds, and along with the baseball world, obviously lost a legend in Pete Rose shortly, not too long ago. It's such a complex legacy. How do Reds fans view him nowadays? And do you think there's any avenue? I mean, it's a shame we even have to talk about it this way, but do you think there's any avenue posthumously now for him to be inducted into the Hall of Fame at some point?
Well, there is. The short answer is sure, there is. Whether or not the family would accept that at this point, I'm not so sure. And there's been some rumblings that the family really doesn't want that to happen. It was Pete's wishes that he not go in posthumously. And I can understand that. And there's a lot of bitterness. I can tell you as a Cincinnatian, the issue isn't his crimes. His crimes are well documented. His misdeeds towards law in general and the sport of baseball, well documented. And, it took too long for him to acknowledge them. And he admitted that when he was alive. Certainly, I watched the many documentaries on his life, and the most recent one that I believe was on Netflix did a very good job of delving into that as to why it took Pete so long to acknowledge that and come to grips with that. And the rest of the city had to come to grips with that. I think at this point, I don't see Pete going in anytime soon because I think baseball understands what his wishes were, and they had a standoff, and they, I think, are just going to let Pete be part of Cincinnati, let his legacy live on organically, if you will. And I think that's just the way it's going to go forward. I am reading the book Charlie Hustle, Keith O'Brien's wonderful detailing of his life, his rise and fall. Keith O'Brien is a Cincinnati native as well, like I am, and he just does an incredible job of documenting what it was to be a Cincinnatian, growing up with Pete Rose, what he meant to the city. And I think his legacy is what he did on the field, and that's the best way to remember his significance to this city and to the sport of baseball. Whether or not he gets into Cooperstown, to me, at this point, is moot.
It's a good point, and we all had great conversations around the time about when Pete Rose passed, and I feel like he should always be a talking point because of how he played the game. And you mentioned being on the field. That's how he should be remembered. For me, the most famous picture is him, full dive, hair hanging out of the helmet. Everything about him represents baseball. And doing a lot, well, doing the most with what he was given. And I think that's the best story that we always hear about him, is that as far as his skill set, he would be the first one to admit he stretched every inch out of what he was given by God, you know?
Well, and to me, the thing about Pete Rose and the reason he touched my life as a kid growing up in this city was I'll always remember going to Reds games, Big Red Machine games with my dad, and sharing the moment he would hustle down to first base after a walk or go from first to third, like we were talking about Elly De La Cruz earlier, head first slide into third base, or, you know, the collisions, the countless collisions at home plate. Everybody remembers Ray Fosse from the 1970 All-Star game, but there were many others like that people don't remember, that people like me do, because we saw it in person. I just love the way he went full bore on everything he did, and I kind of embraced part of that for my career, because I try to, you know, instill in myself that you may not be better than everybody else, you may not be as good as everybody else, but you can damn sure try as hard or harder than anybody else. And that, to me, is the lesson of Pete Rose in his prime, when baseball was his life. And I think when you took away baseball, you started to see the other parts of his life that were unsavory. And, you know, to me, you know, maybe people would say baseball was the makeup on Pete Rose. And when you took the makeup off, you got to see maybe a not so pretty side of him. One of the prized possessions in my office here is a Pete Rose game used bat. And it hangs up behind me in the office for very good reason, because it reminds me, it's a constant reminder of what hard work is, and 4192, and what it means to amass that many hits, to, you know, become the greatest hitter in, or the most prolific hitter in baseball history. And, you know, that's how I'm going to choose to remember Pete Rose. And I know there were other things that came with him, but I try to remember the man who had a great impact on me when I was a kid.
Very well said. And I think everybody could take a lot away from the way he played the game by trying and putting their overall effort into everything they do. But going back to the on the field product here for 2025, for the NL Central right now, we looked at a lot of active participants in this, most notably the Cubs. But if the Reds are looking to attain that division crown once again, who do you see as the bigger threat? Is it the Cubs, who just made all those acquisitions this offseason, or is it the Brewers, the reigning and defending already Central champs?
I just think it's the Brewers. The way their organization is run top to bottom, to me, is one of the model organizations in all of baseball. They change out their manager. Pat Murphy, I think, is a tremendous major league manager, knows his talent very, very well. I just think he does a tremendous job. I think their run, again, their front office does a great job of acquiring different talent, trading away talent, getting younger and deeper throughout the organization and throughout their lineup. To me, it's the Milwaukee Brewers. You have to compete with the Milwaukee Brewers. And Nick Kroll has always said in the last several years, the team really to beat in the division is Milwaukee, simply because of the way they approach not only the single season, but multiple seasons down the road. They are always forward thinking. And I think that, you know, the Reds have to be in that same mindset. Again, knowing what their budget limitations are, they have to have that same type of mindset. And if they do, I think the Reds have as much young talent as the Brewers do. And that's why I think it's going to be fascinating to see how Terry Francona handles the amount of talent that he has on the roster, the amount of young talent, and how he molds them, shapes them, motivates them. That's going to be a fascinating story to watch. But it's the Milwaukee Brewers for me.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that. The Brewers just seem to figure it out every year. Yeah. And all they do is let superstars walk out the door, too. Yep. And so that's why they continue to surprise us. I guess we shouldn't be surprised anymore, but you trade a Corbin Burns, you trade a Josh Hader, you let Willie Adames go to San Francisco, and we'll see if they can do it again here. Looking back on the Reds offseason so far, I know it's not over yet, but so far, has there been a move you wish they would have made? Maybe a player that could have come to Cincinnati that ended up somewhere else?
I always thought Alex Bregman, and I know that the price tag would probably be too high. He would have been the perfect fit to me. He would have brought the experience, certainly the third base bat that would immediately fill a hole. It would extend your lineup in the depth of your lineup. And he's a right-handed power hitter. Remember, I spoke, 20 minutes, 30 minutes ago about how they have precious little true right-handed pop. Well, Alex Bregman would address that right off the bat. To me, he would be the guy that I kind of wish they would have gone out and acquired, but I understand the financial limitations. And, that's why they had to get creative with a guy like Gavin Lux. Even though he's not a right-handed bat, he is certainly someone who can fill multiple roles. And I will say this about Nick Krall and Brad Meador, the assistant GM with the Reds, the GM, the assistant to Nick Krall, is that they have chosen a path of depth over impact. And what I mean by that is they're not going to go out and get the number one player at a position. They would rather go out and get several good players at multiple positions and hope that their offensive needs are filled that way, because they feel that's a more financially effective way to go about it, given their budget.
So in your time covering the Reds, I know you mentioned before you had covered the Red Sox extensively. So I guess it's a two-part question. What has been your most memorable moment covering these Reds? And then compare it to when your time covering all those Red Sox teams from years past.
Oh, that's a tough question. I would say my most memorable moment covering the Reds was probably Elly De La Cruz's Major League debut. I mean, it doesn't get more dramatic than that, and more exciting than that. And if you're going to talk about one moment where Great American Ballpark was just off the hook electric in the last couple of years, since the 2015 Major League Baseball All-Star Game, the one that Todd Frazier won the Home Run Derby in, I would say it would have been the cycle against the Atlanta Braves on the Friday night. I'd never heard the building that loud. It was World Series loud, and I'm not kidding. It's not hyperbole. When he slid into third base for that triple to complete the cycle, it was like the Reds had just won the World Series. And that's the kind of thing that brings fans to, the expectation that this team can compete for a World Series. Now, comparing that to the Red Sox, I think with the Red Sox, there was the expectation every year that the team was going to compete for a World Series. That began with John Henry in 2002. They made a mistake with Grady Little, but how long did they stick with Grady Little? One season. Then they got Terry Francona in 2004. And we all know, and well, I certainly remember about that season, July 26, 2004, the team was really going nowhere. Then the fight happened with A-Rod and Jason Varitek. And then even a couple of weeks after that, maybe 10 days after that, they were still not playing great baseball. But then David Ortiz hit a big home run, and I forget where it was, but he hit a massive home run, and they just suddenly kind of took off. And ever since that moment, and obviously coming back from 3-0 down against the Yankees, they expected to win. And that's the culture that changed in my time in Boston, because when I started there, it was 1993. And they were still chasing the Yankees. They had to go through the late 90s dynasty of the Yankees, and it looked like the Yankees dynasty was just going to roll over them like they always do. And then with that one win, it changed the expectation. And then they won again in 2007. And then that year, they were actually the division champion, not the wild card. And there was a new standard set. And that expectation going forward was to compete for and win a World Series every single year. Obviously, you're not going to do that, but that was the expectation. The Reds are working, their standard is much lower than that. And that is the comparison I would draw here. The Reds are still trying to build up to that. And it's fascinating. You had Terry Francona at the pinnacle of those expectations with the Red Sox. Here with the Reds, kind of like it was with Cleveland, he is at the start of the buildup. And it's going to be interesting to me to see how Francona handles that.
So, Mike, you've given us a ton of time here, and we really, really appreciate it. We're going to get you out of here on this one last question. So, Steve and I, in our last regular episode, started a segment, a Mount Rushmore segment, where we'll come up with different categories. Our first one was role players, but I'm going to give you a different one here. Just growing up in Cincinnati and now covering the Reds and the Bengals and college sports as well, if you had to name a Mount Rushmore of Cincinnati professional athletes, or I guess you could go college as well,
sure,
of all time, give me four.
Okay. Pete Rose, Oscar Robertson, Johnny Bench has to be on there. And I got one more.
One more.
Yeah, one more.
Oh, I'm going to go Joe Burrow, because there hasn't been a better football player that I've seen or I've been a fan of in my 58 years on the planet than Joe Burrow. So I'd go with those four.
Bonus question, and I know this is a baseball podcast, but we're going to throw this in here. Is there any way T. Higgins is back in Cincinnati next year? What's the percentage? Yes.
Okay. I would say right now it's about 60%. Yes, it does happen. The Bengals I think the Bengals are committed to finding a way to have Jamar and T back with Joe Burrow, because they realize if they have them back, the defense is going to be what the defense is. They hope to get a new defensive coordinator in and reshuffle the deck, and by default have a better defense than they had this year. And if by default you have a better defense and you bring back the offense and Joe Burrow stays healthy, you're talking about a Super Bowl caliber team.
I love it. And you guys can check out all that Bengals stuff over there with the Jungle Roar podcast, wherever you can find podcast audio, Apple, Spotify, etc. Mike does a great job. Make sure you guys follow him during the offseason and the regular season with the Reds, the Code Reds, the Cincinnati Reds podcast by CLNS Media. Amazing stuff over there. Mike, I'll give you a few seconds to talk about whatever else you have going on right now in the offseason, maybe on Twitter. I know you have a big following over there on Twitter at Trags, TRAGS. Everybody make sure you give him a follow. But anything you want to get out there and let everybody know.
I'm glad you asked. Derek Johnson, Reds pitching coach, will be my guest on the Code Reds podcast this coming Monday. I'm looking forward to asking him a ton of questions, including whether or not the Reds are going to follow the suit of maybe a couple of other teams, maybe the Dodgers, of a 6-man pitching rotation, because I think the Reds are in a position in terms of their depth where they could actually pull that off and pull it off very effectively. So I'm looking forward to having Derek Johnson on the Code Reds podcast this coming Monday on CLNScincy.com. You can also follow it on the Cincinnati Sports Studio on YouTube.com. Be sure to follow all my content on CLNScincy with a Y.com. I also write about Cincinnati Bearcats and Xavier basketball. Xavier with a big win over my alma mater, Villanova, on Tuesday night. I have a column up there about Ryan Conwell, the transfer from Indiana State, who's having a terrific year with Xavier.
Awesome, Mike. We want to thank you again. And for everybody else, we'll be back in just one. Well, once again, we want to thank Mike Petraglia for joining us here. You guys, again, can follow him covering all things Reds, Code Reds, the Cincinnati Reds podcast, CLNS Media, all the great stuff, all the great conversation, and a genuine excitement for what Cincinnati has planned for the MLB season. You can hear it in his voice, Devin.
Yeah, and I loved hearing it from somebody who is Cincinnati-based, grew up in Cincinnati, is covering all Cincinnati sports. You can hear that he really believes that they could be, take the next step this year. I think MLB has some belief in that as well. Don't forget, they're a part of that new Speedway Classic at Bristol, the Reds against the Braves, I think in August. And, part of that maybe is Elly and his speed. Maybe they wanted to do that kind of comparison, but they wouldn't put them in that kind of spotlight if they didn't believe that maybe the Reds can be a little more relevant this year.
Very good point, Devin. Honestly, I think it's good for baseball if this market has a team, especially with the excitement that Elly De La Cruz brings on a daily basis. But the rest of those players on the team, there's a lot to be excited about in Cincinnati. So you guys can make sure you guys follow at Trags, TRAGS, for all things Reds. He has a great follow. A lot of great stuff being posted, not just for Cincinnati Reds, but the Bengals, as we mentioned, Cincinnati Bearcats, all the great stuff happening over there. So Devin, any final thoughts before we get out of here? I know we did a good conversation here about the Reds, but anything on your mind right now? Because I know we're doing a double episode this week.
Well, I'm just going to comment a little more on what Mike said there. I mean, there's some baseball stuff going on, but we'll keep it Red-centric for now. It caught me by surprise that when he was talking about the pitching staff, Nick Lodolo as his main X factor, almost a forgotten man. We use this post-hype term so much. He would fall into that category as well. Straight up said that Nick Lodolo has the best stuff on that staff. That is a staff that includes Hunter Green with some wicked stuff. So, but I get it. Nick Lodolo at his best is nasty. And think of what that rotation, the potential it has if Lodolo works out, if Hunter Green can do what he did last year, Rhett Lauder bursting onto the scene, Brady Singer just kind of play his role, do his job. Like, you're looking at a team that could be pretty good pretty dynamic on both sides. So let's see.
So Devin, I know we don't usually like to announce guests in advance, but it seems like we have a guest next week locked in and the week after. But you want to talk about the guest we have lined up for next week, talking about the team that everyone's been excited about talking about. Maybe the proud owners of Roki Sasaki. We don't know yet, though.
Well, I was going to say, I think so. Divine Sports Gospel, they do a great job. Super entertaining coverage, whether it be podcasts, tweets, other things of all San Diego sports. But obviously, the Padres kind of take the spotlight a lot there. So that episode next week with Matt from Divine Sports Gospel could go one of two ways. He's either going to be elated as a fan of now Roki Sasaki for his team, or he's going to be upset that most likely he went to the Dodgers. I mean, obviously the Blue Jays are still in there too, but I think it's one of those two if I had to guess. So, that you can look forward to that sometime next week. I'm excited for that one. They do a really good job. If anyone's out there, they don't follow them, even if you're not a San Diego person, they talk about other baseball things as well. Really good stuff.
So we should be dropping that episode midweek next week, but of course we'll be back early in the week. On Martin Luther King Day, a lot of people have off from work, so maybe you guys on the drive into work on Tuesday morning, back to the grind, you guys can check us out with our normal episode, about an hour and a half of conversation about all the news, and who knows what else is going to happen. As we mentioned before with Mike on here, the offseason is not over. Just because the hot stove has cooled off doesn't mean the news has stopped. There's a lot of free agents out there left to be signed.
Yeah, I'm hearing my Mets are pretty much giving a little bit of a deadline to Pete Alonso now and said, like, hey, we need to know your answer, because if it's a no, we need some time to pivot. So lots of rumblings still going on out there.
So make sure you guys follow us on Instagram and on Twitter at TableSettersPod for all your updates. Devin is doing a great job running the Twitter machine over there. There's a lot of good content over there, engagement. So engage with what we're talking about here and give us some ideas about what we should be talking about in the future. It's a long off season, so give us some topics. What do you think about our Mount Rushmore? Is there another Mount Rushmore we should do? Or maybe you just ultimately disagree with the Mount Rushmore of the role players we put out there. Maybe you don't like Brent Zobrist. Who knows? Maybe you don't like Luis Soho. I don't know. Maybe you're not one of those guys, but we have a lot of good conversation awaiting for you guys. We'll be back and we'll talk to you after a while.
High fly ball into right field. She is gone. In a year that has been so improbable, the impossible has happened. This one by Mattingly. Oh!